I'm delighted to have you all. Today's topic is going to be on corporate and crisis communications, led by CEO Molly Levinson and Managing Director Kay Verville of the Levinson Group, which we're delighted to have speaking with us today. I'm going to turn it over to them just in a minute to introduce themselves, explain a little more about the Levinson Group, and then get into the meat of our conversation. But just a couple of quick housekeeping items before I do. I see a lot of people have got their video chats going. Feel free to turn your cameras on if you're comfortable. We swear no judgment on your background, but it just helps make the conversation a little more fun and interactive. You'll have seen the chat function. This is the way that we're going to take questions throughout the presentation. So feel free to throw your questions into the chat as you think of them, and we'll answer as we go. And then we will save a little bit of time for questions at the end as well. And then lastly, the presentation will be available as well as contact information for Kay and Molly after the presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kay and Molly to say a little bit more about the Levinson Group and get us started.
Thanks so much, Claire. And it's nice to meet you all virtually. Just quickly about our firm, we're a boutique firm and work really closely with leaders and companies really who are facing either strategically very important decisions or tough decisions in those moments. And so we're a team who we've sort of strategically designed around capabilities, both in understanding those moments and then being able to, understand all of the different considerations that go into navigating those moments and turning those moments into opportunities. And that is a lot of what we're going to focus on today, is just when you're in a, crisis situation and a challenging situation, how to communicate so that you're mitigating risks and also recognizing the opportunities that exist within them. So, we've worked with lots of different entities, boards, and C-suites in major corporations and also startup organizations. And so really try to help our clients based on where they are sort of in their growth to be able to, engage their key stakeholders in all of these moments, whether it's media, or whether it is their employees or consumers or funders or others. I'll turn it over to Kay to talk a little bit about how we framed this session.
Great, thanks, Molly. So our objectives today are sort of twofold. We want to help you all sort of give you some concrete and practical steps and actions that you can take right now in this crisis situation that the world is dealing with COVID-19, but also help you understand some of the broader principles that we apply always and that we consider best practice with the companies that we work with on a regular basis so that you can take these and apply them to your own businesses going forward. And that includes both how to effectively engage your key stakeholders in these, sort of dynamic, fast-moving crisis environments. And, I think a lot of people think, we'll get into this a little bit more, but a lot of people think about communications being about talking to the press or talking to media, and it's really much broader than that. So we'll talk about how to effectively reach all of the groups who are critical to your business and your operations. And then also helping you think about not only how to navigate this situation or other crisis situations that you might face, but how to take advantage of those opportunities and leverage the opportunities that those bring to be able to sort of further and enhance your brand and create loyalty.
So one of the things that we have found in our experience is that in a crisis moment, and we're all seeing this right now as the global pandemic is affecting us, but crisis moments tend to play themselves out on communications channels. So if it's a challenging moment, you experience it sometimes, within your employees, sort of internally inside a company, and it also plays out in the media. But a very important mindset for navigating communications in this moment is understanding that just because a crisis or a challenge is playing out in public relations avenues, it doesn't mean that it's a public relations problem. So oftentimes the solutions to the problem aren't just like a PR fix. They are actually a core business fix. And so we try to approach everything with that kind of mindset and encourage leaders to do that. And in the same way, we try to break down silos, because just, if something is playing out in PR channels and public relations channels, it can obviously become a significant business problem. And so we try, as we approach these challenges, to think through decision-making processes where business objectives remain at the forefront all the time, so that if there is a communications challenge or a legal challenge or something else, obviously the focus is there, but it's not taking priority over the overall business objectives. And keeping those objectives in mind all the time is the key to making it through any crisis or challenge.
So as we get into some more of the specifics and the tactics, we just want to kind of set the scene for what we think of as being some of the absolutely fundamental core principles of communicating during a crisis. And I think these are the most important things to just keep in mind as guiding principles when you're thinking about this now, and also, in the future, if you are dealing with a communications challenge in your business. The first is preparation. I don't know if anyone has been addicted to Andrew Cuomo's press conferences the way that I have, but yesterday he said by the time the storm hits, it's usually too late to prepare, which is sort of how we approach things with our clients. So later we'll walk through some of the tactics for helping you think through, what it means to prep for a crisis and what you need to communicate. But this is really the most important thing. And, I think you guys are here, so you sort of understand this a little bit already, is thinking through in advance, what might we face in the future? How might we handle it? What are we prepared for? And what are we not prepared for? And how can we address that? And the reason that is important is because in a crisis situation, the timelines that many companies are used to working on, and startups, I think, are a little bit more equipped because you are nimble and you are used to working in dynamic, fast-paced environments. But in a crisis situation, you are usually talking about minutes and hours for decision-making and for communicating with key stakeholders, not days. And that environment can be a really tough one to make good, smart decisions. So it helps to be able to have that groundwork and that thinking in place already, so that you can sort of move forward in a way that is strategic and not just reactionary. Just looking at our questions. This third one is an issue that I think a lot of companies and a lot of clients that we work with struggle with when they're communicating in a crisis. Oftentimes these scenarios are extremely dynamic. You don't have all the information that you want at the time. Companies feel a tension between the pressure to communicate on the one hand, but not having a full picture of information, or the situation is changing every minute, and sort of trying to make that balance. And I think one of the most important things that you can think about as a company when you're struggling to communicate in these challenging moments is the importance of just setting expectations and then meeting those expectations with your stakeholders. So you can communicate incomplete information. You can say, we don't know. This is a thing a lot of companies, I think, feel a lot of reticence to do. And then you can also sort of rely on process, which we'll talk a lot about process throughout the course of this webinar. But it can be really helpful when you're communicating in a dynamic situation to focus on, here's what we're doing. We don't have all the information right now, but here's the process that we're taking. And here's what you can expect from us in that process. And then finally, we'll spend a lot of time on this in the course of this presentation, but it's important to remember that all of these situations, they're a challenge, yes, but they're also an opportunity. So crisis is by its nature a pretty reactive kind of environment and communications challenge, but you actually have the opportunity to create real brand loyalty if you handle the situation correctly. So thinking about it sort of strategically while it's happening is hard to do, but it can create a lot of positives can come out of it. And I think, even just thinking about some of the companies who are communicating around the coronavirus crisis right now, they're thinking long term. So, for instance, I know Morgan Stanley came out and said they wouldn't be firing or doing any layoffs in 2020. This sort of long-term thinking is going to help them. Not only does it sort of play well from a PR perspective, customers like that they're being proactive and responsible towards the stakeholder group, but if they're thinking about attracting talent in the future, the way that they're handling this crisis now will be an asset to them in the long term. Okay, so we will talk a little bit about the process of communicating during a crisis and sort of the tools that we think are the most important to help you be successful in these situations. The most important thing that we talk about is the rapid response process. So what is that? Process is one of the most important parts of responding in a crisis situation. What that allows you to do is take out some of the kind of unknowns and puts a framework in place for you to be able to make quick decisions on the fly. The most important thing is having the right team in place. And this is something that you want to think through in advance. And we'd encourage you to be thinking about now, especially in light of the coronavirus. I think, many companies that we work for have set up coronavirus task force or their coronavirus working group. And so, that's something we would encourage you to do in this situation, but also thinking more broadly, who is your crisis working group going to be if something, comes up in the future for your business? Having the right team in place is really important to being successful in responding to that. So your team needs to be small so that it's nimble and you can make decisions pretty quickly, but it also needs to include the right people so that you have decision-making power in the room and that you're positioned to make calls quickly, and then that you have the right people involved, not only so that you have perspective from across the business. So it shouldn't just be, your CEO and your COO. You need to have your legal perspective, operational perspective, and communications perspective. And then those people need to be able to go and execute really quickly. The next is infrastructure. So this is probably a fancier word than what we're talking about, but having an infrastructure in place, or at least having an understanding of what your crisis working group's infrastructure will be, is really important. So what does that mean? Tactically, this is something we set up with all of our clients in these situations. It's a regular touch point with your working group or your task force, whatever you choose to call them. Sometimes that's daily, sometimes that's twice daily, sometimes it's less frequently, but having that set up in advance is really important. Understanding what your communications channels are. So how do you, as a business now, how do you communicate with the people that you need to reach? Do you have the right distribution lists in place if there's a crisis? You don't want to be going and sort of trying to frantically gather all the emails for your sales staff, when you're dealing with a really highly charged situation. Do you have what you need in place to make updates to your website? Do you have informed employees who can help you execute on whatever plan it is that you come up with in your working group? And then finally, internal and external messengers. So this is a really important part of a communications function that I think a lot of people overlook, which is your messengers are not just your CEO who sends an email to your employees or who might do an interview with the Wall Street Journal when you're in a crisis situation. It's everyone who is a brand ambassador for your company. So that is clients who might talk about you in the marketplace. That is your other employees who talk to people in the industry, potential new hires who are talking to your clients directly, vendors who you work with. So it's important to think about in advance who are those people who are our messengers and what do we need to reach them with. And we'll get more into those audiences in a little bit. And then finally, identifying your communications triggers. So in a crisis situation, you know, obviously you're dealing with a lot. You're dealing with operational implications, you know, maybe legal implications. And it's helpful to sort of think 2 steps ahead and say, okay, what are the developments that are going to require us to communicate with these stakeholder groups? What are some external factors that could come into play here that might impact this plan? How are we going to deal with that? What will we say? And in a few slides, we'll get into some of the specifics around sort of scenario planning on these items as it relates to COVID-19.
So I just want to quickly, we've been getting some questions, which I'm so happy people are asking, and you should, everyone should feel free to jump in if you have them. So before we go to the next slide, just want to quickly address them. First off, we have one about, you know, how does a company deal with something that comes from within, a challenge that comes from within the company. So, you know, we saw this in the example of Away, when, you know, employees internally spoke on social media about problems with their leadership. And you know, our next slide actually addresses some of the core themes that you want to think about, in particular when you are communicating with workforces and shaping internal communications. And this is a piece actually, and we are going to get into the details of stakeholder groups in a little bit, but understanding the sort of ecosystem of communications around how employees and internal communications can trigger external communications is really, really important in a crisis. You know, I think there's a misperception sometimes that everything that's challenging plays out in the media, but the truth about most sort of PR problems now is that they often stem from, you know, rumors, innuendo, disgruntled employees, falsehoods, internal problems that then seep outside. And so one of the pieces, and this is a core piece, of being able to communicate with employees and workforces and managers effectively are sort of maintaining these themes. And you know, if there is a slide besides the process that you take away from this webinar, it may be this theme slide, which is, you know, maintaining a posture of strength all the time. Transparency is obviously hugely important, particularly as we contend with this pandemic. You know, internal workforces want to know what decisions are being made. They want to understand what expectations are. They want to understand thinking about, you know, day-to-day processes that have changed and that are important to them. You know, sort of cultural norms within companies that have totally changed because we're all working from home, or you know, not in an office together. You know, folks are contending with their families and balancing other priorities. And so that transparency and just being able to have workforces feel that they can trust their leadership is obviously critical. Also, you know, I would say in terms of leadership, one of the things we're finding in the midst of the pandemic is that piece about accessibility. You know, it means something different to be accessible today on April 1st, 2020 as a CEO or a, you know, a manager of a lot of people than it did 3 weeks ago. And I think being mindful of what that is, you know, it's not office hours anymore. And it may, you know, town halls used to go a long way. There may be a need to sort of change up that direct communication with direct reports, team communication, so that, you know, people really feel like they can reach you. And have a direct line to you if needed. So all of these different core themes are really important. There's a couple other questions I think here that I'm just gonna read out loud, and then we can figure out if we should address them later in the webinar or now. But one is that in an environment where financial and HR are strapped, how should we prioritize? And I think maybe Kay, let's address that as a part of the rapid response process before we go into stakeholder groups. And I'll turn it over to you to do that, but I'll read one more question, which is guidelines or ideas in terms of interactions levels with external clients that may need help. And let's get to that after we deal with prioritizing financial and HR in the next slide about stakeholder groups, if that makes sense.
Sorry, I was muted. So to the first question about handling competing priorities, particularly when we have sort of areas of the business that are especially strapped, I think we would go back to this slide, which is really sort of how we encourage clients to make decisions in these situations and sort of how they should guide all of their decision making. So, you know, when it comes to making communications decisions in a crisis, it always has to start with what are the business objectives? And so a lot of times there are competing priorities. You know, we find this all the time when we're working with clients who have their external legal advisors, they have internal, you know, HR, finance, everyone has different priorities. And it's true, sometimes those priorities are conflicting. You know, sometimes what makes sense for the finance teams, you know, stakeholders or for their own operations will present, you know, a real challenge in communications or in HR. So, you know, ultimately, that is why it is so important to approach these things holistically, and that your working group includes, you know, your crisis response working group includes people from all parts of your business to be able to sort of weigh in and provide that different perspective. And, you know, I don't think that there's one right answer to this about, you know, what should take priority all the time. Ultimately, it's a weighing of the business decision and what's going to best support your business objectives. I don't know, Molly, if you have anything sort of specific to add. I think it's sort of each situation is different, and there's no, you know, one right answer. I think this question just highlights the importance of, you know, approaching it in a holistic way.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think breaking down silos, having these task forces, having, you know, we mentioned as a part of the rapid response process, a group of decision makers that's going to be cross-cutting across all your functions. And that way, you know, if different departments are tapped out, you know, you can help each other. And I think, you know, part of the key of assembling that group, and, you know, you all know as you're leading companies sort of who your go-to sort of deputies are in these cases, but, at the same time that you want a group of decision makers in that task force, you also want folks who can really execute. So, balancing between the need to make top decisions and to get things done can, in sort of the individuals who you pick to help make those decisions, can make a difference in that kind of prioritization.
I'll just go forward to this slide where we were, and I think that this will be helpful in addressing that other question that had come through so far. So we've talked about this a little bit, but it's really important that when we're thinking about communicating in a crisis situation, that we're thinking holistically, not just internally in the business, but also about who you need to communicate with. And, I mentioned, I think a lot of people think about communications as being like, let's put out a press release, or let's talk to the media, or, they think it's what takes place, and what you read in the press. But it's a lot more than that, and your business relies on the trust and cooperation of many more stakeholders than the media. And in fact, these other stakeholders are arguably much more important to the operations of your business. So the approach to each of the, there may be other sort of specific ones to your business, but these are sort of the key sort of groups or buckets that we most commonly think about with our clients. So employees obviously are critical. Your customers, business partners, so that might be, vendors and suppliers, other organizations that you have joint ventures with, your funders and investors, government and regulators obviously are critical, and then, media and public, which in a way are sort of secondary to these in that they're an influencer of these other audiences, but you have what you need to sort of directly communicate with these stakeholders. So here are the questions that I think are really important to ask yourself when we're communicating with each of these groups in a crisis situation. It's important that your message is tailored. So what works for employees is, not necessarily going to work for your customers. So what we go through with our clients in a crisis situation is basically stakeholder by stakeholder asking, what do they most care about? What is their concern right now? Not just vis-a-vis you or your business, but sort of get in their own mindset. So what are your employees worried about, not just as employees of your company, but as human beings right now in this time? Are your company, your customers may be worried about your own sort of operational continuity and your ability to keep serving them during this pandemic. But they also have other broader worries. So sort of thinking about putting yourself in the mindset of those stakeholders and thinking about what is important to them. How do you reach them? This is different for different stakeholder groups. Obviously, the touch points that you have with your internal employees is different than what you have with customers. And you need to sort of tailor the approach to each of those groups appropriately. And then finally, who influences them? So, who are your kind of secondary messengers, which we alluded to earlier, that also play a role in sort of shaping how your business is viewed by that group. So with your customers, they may get an email from the CEO or maybe from their account manager, but your sales staff, is an equally important part of communicating with them. If you're sort of thinking broadly about, we want to make sure our industry or broadly our kind of peers out there in the world know XYZ about us. An important stakeholder group who influences that is often your HR and recruiting functions, if you have that, who are interviewing candidates and out there talking and recruiting to people. So just sort of thinking about not just how do we directly communicate with that group, but who else are they hearing from about our business, and how can we make sure that those influencers sort of have the understanding that we want them to have about sort of who we are and what we're doing in this situation.
I'm just going to jump in really quickly on this question about communicating with external clients who, what's the right level of doing it? I mean, our sense right now is whatever posture you had prior to the pandemic, make it, you know, infinitely more proactive now, particularly with clients. And just thinking through the fact that clients are often clients are experiencing the same challenges you are. And so understanding the kind of support that they can get from you in this moment is just really critical to your relationship with them and to their sort of engagement with what you're doing. You know, if you also, at the same time that you want to have that and maintain that sort of proactive posture, you also really want to avoid being tone deaf. And so, you know, think through the normal marketing messages that you might have with clients if they're not related to, you know, what's happening every day, and consider whether the messages are just going to fall flat or, you know, even be offensive at this time. So proactive engagement in terms of helping clients, supporting clients, you know, communicating with clients, but maybe thinking really, really hard about sort of unrelated activities in client engagement. And, you know, if it's something that you would have sent without thinking 4 weeks ago, think really hard about sending it or saying it before you do it today, if that makes sense. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's okay. I mean, the only other thing that I would add is I think a good lens for this, or just like the word that I keep coming back to, as you know, we have been counseling clients through these issues for the last several weeks, is just relevance. So what was relevant to us and to our clients 3 or 4 weeks ago just may be totally irrelevant, and to Molly's point, you know, approaching offensive now. But I think that there are companies out there who are communicating with their clients in a way that also still promotes their company and their brand, but has made it relevant to the time that we're in. So, you know, for some consumer brands where, you know, I've gotten emails where I'm like, why are you telling me how, like, yoga studio, how, you know, sad you are about this situation, but you're not, that's it. Okay, I get it. But there are other consumer brands who are saying, you know, here is what we're doing. We have these capabilities. We're making PPE for medical providers. And if you, you know, any purchase for the next week will be 20% towards whatever. So they found a way to sort of make what they're doing and who they are relevant to these times. So I think that's just sort of like the key lens to think about as you're thinking about like how and when do we talk to clients. We don't need to spend too long on this slide, but I just thought that this was a helpful tool. This is just a tactic that we use with clients a lot to help them kind of organize their thoughts on communicating with stakeholders in these situations. So it's something you guys can take away in the deck, which you'll have access to after this, sort of thinking through who are our stakeholder groups, articulating what their concerns are, what are the messages that are going to address those concerns, and then sort of what are the tactics or communications collateral, that's like emails and you know, messages and meetings that we're going to use to communicate with them. And here's just, you know, examples of some tactics that can be useful to you at this time, but also just more generally. You know, obviously you can communicate directly via emails. You have your owned channels, you know, social media, your external website, your internet. You have sort of press releases or holding statements that you can use with media, direct outreach from leaders towards your employees. And, you know, today that might mean Zoom meetings or Zoom one-on-one coffees. A message cascade, which is the word that we use to describe when you sort of arm and equip the people in your organization to communicate with their direct reports, who then communicate with their direct reports, who may communicate with the suppliers that they deal with on a daily basis. So creating materials to help other people spread your message throughout the organization, or helping your sales staff communicate with clients. Your call center, this is one a lot of people don't think about. If you have customer service employees or a call center that you utilize, that is a communications channel that you have. Lobbying and industry association involvement is an important communications vehicle that many companies rely on, but could rely on much more heavily. And then of course, media engagement, direct sort of media engagement with reporters and the press. This is not an exhaustive list, but just sort of to give you a sense of the tools that you have at this time, but also during any sort of situation. Okay. So we talked a little bit earlier about the importance of kind of thinking through in advance, what are the kind of trigger points for your business? We call this scenario planning. And it's important, we'll talk about some of the scenarios we think are most important right now in the time of coronavirus, but this is something that we would highly encourage you to this exercise to go through once this is over. I think it's something that's really helpful to any business. So what is scenario planning? Basically, it is an audit of your business to help identify risks and help you develop response plans and sort of off-the-shelf materials to help you respond to those risks in the moment if any of them were to come to fruition. Obviously, as we've talked about, a key part of this is that it has to be a holistic process. And really, the process of going through this scenario planning is sort of almost as important as the actual plans that you get out of it at the end. So it needs to involve all parts of the business. You need to get perspectives from people across the organization. And it really takes place in 3 phases. So the first is the audit phase, where you're sort of soliciting input from leaders across the business who have insights into issues that your business currently faces, risks that you currently face, and then getting their perspective on potential risks, either that are sort of most likely to happen to you or most impactful. I don't think I don't think that anyone would have identified global pandemic as a most likely risk, but it certainly is something that has been unbelievably impactful. And believe it or not, when we do scenario planning with crisis, with clients, this is one of the scenarios that we include in the process, just because of the massive impact that it poses to all of these businesses. So the second phase is then planning. You've identified, the key scenarios, and we've put up here some of the ones that we go through most frequently with our clients and that we find people are most concerned about, or, generally tend to be front of mind. So, leadership issues or changes in leadership, data breach, obviously that's huge. Breakdowns in sort of operational or infrastructure, if you're an oil company, an accident at one of your sites, or if you're manufacturing, something going wrong at one of your plants, whether that's a safety incident or something that impacts your ability to supply customers. Legal and regulatory challenges, so new restrictions that might impact your ability to do business in a certain jurisdiction. Physical threats, so active shooter, or there's a natural disaster that impacts a really key location for you. And then, sort of corporate malfeasance or kind of internal issues that come to light. And obviously, in 2018 and 2019, that's been one that has been really at the forefront.
One thing I'll just add about this scenario planning that maybe should go without saying, but because of the timing and what we're here to talk about, I mean, when you're thinking through any of these scenarios, obviously the conflation between the potential scenario and then what's happening now, as we all face a global pandemic, is really critical. And one of the pitfalls that we see is that, when there is something like what is happening now, where, our eyes and our focus are all on this pandemic and the impact it's having, you can take your eyes off of some of the critical other issues that could transpire. And so thinking about them holistically and separately from this is really important. But then also thinking about the added layer of impact that this would have. I mean, when we go through all of those different scenarios, the physical threat or the leadership changes, or just literally any of them, the legal and regulatory challenges, all of them are impacted by what's happening here. But what's happening with the global pandemic can't drive your thinking and your reaction to every single piece of them. So I think, taking the time also to really think through, that's, as Kay said, it wasn't an exhaustive list of scenarios, and thinking through, the potential scenarios that are really relevant to you and your business and your employees and your decision making now is an important thing to do.
And I know I'm mindful of time, so I won't spend that long on this slide, and then I'll turn it over to you, Molly, to talk about opportunities. But I just wanted to throw this up there for folks. These are the things that we're talking with clients a lot about in terms of preparing for, eventualities that they may need to communicate about right now during this time of the coronavirus. So, if they have, how are we going to communicate if there's a service interruption? If you have a leadership impact who is diagnosed or who is, having to be out of work, drawing on credit or having to close locations. These are some of the sort of most common scenarios or trigger points that we'd encourage you to think about.
So, we talked at the outset of the webinar about really the opportunities that come within challenges. And obviously, defining your voice as leaders is a significant opportunity at this moment. Whether it's with your employees, with your clients, with consumers, with your funders, at the same time that we are facing these challenges, thinking through how you're going to communicate what all of those stakeholder groups need and want, what is going to engage them right now, and really being meaningful and thoughtful when you do engage is going to make a tremendous difference for you as leaders in your companies. One on this slide, one piece of this that is just incredibly critical to understand, particularly with American workforces. And, I would be interested in a longer conversation with those of you who are joining us from Ireland, because I imagine that there's a difference here. But, Americans are really looking to their employers to help guide them through this far more than they are to government. And so just thinking through, how your team can be more solidified, how your brand can be more engaged and understood and prominent at this moment, really there's a significant opportunity there to think through. And then, we talked a little bit earlier about, how the pandemic affects some of the challenges, but there are some opportunities here. Everybody's doing Zocktails or Zoom cocktails. It's not often that you can sit and see your colleagues' kids or their kids can be a part of your work conversations. The same goes for your clients and for consumers. You're able to show some humanity as brands. If some of you have brands that are a little bit more removed, this is an opportunity to bring them closer to folks. And then just, we've been freed of infrastructure. It doesn't matter if you have a fancy office right now. And so, in all the ways that you can think about how this is an opportunity for you and turning, shaping your communication way, and your marketing and your messages and your engagement can be really valuable. Oh, that's you. Is that you, Kay, or is that me? It's me.
That's you.
Okay, sorry everyone. So, you know, we have some of these are sort of checklists for you as you're thinking about how to establish these messages. You know, obviously you want to understand who you're talking to. For those of you who do engage with the media, or have sort of media who are following what you do every day, obviously making sure they understand as much as they can about your planning and your thinking and your outcomes right now. You know, tailoring your messages with today in mind. You know, not using that same marketing campaign that you developed 3 months ago. Even if it's fantastic, you can probably return to it again, but just making sure it's really resonant for right now. And then, you know, facts matter a lot right now. And so when you're thinking through, you know, when you're going to make a statement, you know, in order to maintain that transparency and accountability and trust, and to make promises that stick, make sure that you're underscoring it with proof points. And think about who the spokespeople are. You know, is there something that's coming out of your company that normally your press person would say, or your chief marketing officer would say, that you should say because you're the CEO and you could say it more effectively right now to press? Take that opportunity. And then make sure you also, you know, set up that rapid response team and that task force or SWAT team squad, so that, you know, if there are challenges to navigate, you know, you're working through them as best you can.
And I would just add, I got a question that came through in the chat about, you know, how do you keep communications relevant in all this noise? You know, you're getting emails from every vendor that you've ever worked with. And there's obviously just a lot of conversation happening out there around what companies are doing, and, you know, how do you have, what's your toolbox to help cut through? And I think, you know, I would point you here, which is, you know, smart messages underscored by real proof points that make those messages come to life. And I think, you know, to our earlier point around, you know, PR problems aren't business problems. PR solutions are more than PR solutions, they're business solutions. So really looking within your company for what are those actual, you know, real operational proof points that you have to share. And that is what is going to differentiate you and help you cut through all of the sort of conversation around here's how our company is reacting to COVID. You know, it really stems from what the business is doing and what the actions that you're taking, what those are. And then the communications follows on from that. You know, then you can talk about, okay, how are we going to message what we're doing, and who's going to be our, you know, who's the appropriate messenger in this time for those actions.
So, you know, one piece of this that is obviously very important externally, because we've spent a lot of time on internal stakeholders, is also just, you know, how is the media approaching this moment? And you know, they're sort of, how does the media, how do journalists approach any moment? But then, you know, layered on to this one is the fact that, you know, like all of us, their newsrooms are really lean. They are very short-staffed. Their editors are really overwhelmed. They are taking longer to push stories through. With broadcast, there, you know, and radio and podcasts, everything is taking longer. So I think the overriding piece of advice that we have at this moment when engaging with the media is be patient. Be patient, because they're living through this like you are. Trust matters. You know, hearing from sources who they know really matters. If you're looking to pitch a news story or a reporter who you don't know, or your press folks are, you know, take even more time right now to establish that relationship and the credibility, because you know, just like with every other relationship, the relationships that are forged with journalists during this time can be more meaningful as well.
I want to leave time for questions, so I'll just quickly whip us through what we see as the key takeaway actions, hopefully for you guys coming out of this in terms of how you can set up best practice communications during the COVID-19 crisis, but also just moving forward. So the first is figuring out who your working group team is. Some of you are super lean organizations, so maybe that's you, maybe that's you and one other person, but making sure you understand who needs to be involved in decision-making and in executing. Articulating what your business's core messages are, that comes from your business objectives. That's not a PR exercise. You know, that's sort of fundamentally, you know, who you are, and that should guide the communications that you put out at this time, but at all times. Thinking through and identifying your key audiences. So we'd encourage you to sort of go through that grid that we had up there and think about, you know, okay, who do we need to communicate with in different scenarios and what do they care about? And then finally, identifying the key trigger points that you have, you know, in the near term as it relates to COVID-19. And, you know, how are you going to prepare for those scenarios in advance to the extent that you're able?